Bev, when it comes to what is now an invasion of almost 2 years by Russia, I don't like that term stalemate because it implies that nothing is changing there. I think there's a lot of media chat right now because the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the past 6 months didn't have a decisive breakthrough. Hands go up, oh my gosh, Ukraine's losing, or at best, they'll never be able to regain the territory that Vladimir Putin has seized. First of all, that's not entirely true. There have been gradual advances by Ukraine. Secondly, I think it misses the wider context. If you think back where we were in February 2022, Russia had hoped, Putin had hoped, he would overrun Kyiv. He would knock out the Zelensky government and conquer Ukraine within weeks. It didn't happen. Instead, look where we are in December 2023. Ukraine has regained about half the territory that Russia seized in the past 21 and a half months. Ukraine has now begun to carry out attacks beyond the front lines into Russian-occupied territory in Russia itself. But most importantly, who would have guessed that because of this invasion, that NATO would have been bolstered with Finland joining, with Sweden likely to join once Turkey's President Erdogan finally drops his opposition, that the EU would be galvanized and that we would have the prospect, I think in a few years' time, of Ukraine joining the EU as well as NATO. Who would have guessed that countries as far away as Australia would have been brought into this international coalition, which is not just simply, quote, to defeat Putin, but simply to defend a country whose very existence was threatened. I think that wider context is essential as we go into a 2024 where it is a marathon, not a sprint. I think Vladimir Putin has failed with his energy war. He's failed with his food war. The question is in 2024, will he succeed with a political and disinformation war, trying to count on activists in the West to recycle his propaganda lines that we should all just stick to our own problems in Australia, the US, or the UK, and just let him have his way in Ukraine.
Yeah. And of course, it unsurprisingly has now become overshadowed by the explosive reignition of a long-running wound in the Middle East. How taken aback were you by the brutal attacks by Hamas on October 7th?
I was absolutely shocked. First of all, I'm shocked, not as an analyst, but as a human being, that Hamas goes in and carries out what is, let's call it what it is, a mass killing. A mass killing of more than 1,000 people, the large majority of whom are Israeli citizens or foreign nationals, kidnaps more than 250. And then I was, as an analyst, filled with a sense of foreboding that what Hamas had unleashed would then be a cycle of killing by Israel. There was a window where I thought maybe the Israeli leaders will be persuaded by the international community, and not just the US, most of Europe, most of Asia, including Australia, countries in the Middle East, to not try to wipe out Hamas, quote, destroy it, but to use political and economic means to isolate the group. Because if you try to attack Hamas militarily, you won't destroy them. You'll just drive civilians into their arms as those civilians are being killed. But Israel's leaders didn't listen. So where we are in December 2023, I can give you no answers because we're not talking about ceasefire. We're certainly not talking about a settlement. We're talking about an open-ended war inside Gaza with no end game, no idea of who the authority would be to replace Hamas if we ever did get past the killing of those civilians as well as Hamas fighters.
Yeah. And of course, the impact that it may have on the region and other players, and we know Iran has always been one of those players. It too has faced a year of, at first, defiantly open protests for greater freedom. Do you assess that it's been contained, or is it morphed into something different?
Yeah, my friends in Iran, who continue to seek rights, who continue to seek justice, who continue to seek space for political participation, they will refer again and again to fire under the ashes. Yes, as we have seen recurrently, especially since 2009 and the rigged presidential elections, the Iranian regime has enough institutional strength with its security forces, with its paramilitary forces, with the supreme leader and his allies, that they can repress and quash protest. They can kill hundreds of protesters in cold blood. They can detain thousands. They can put out their own propaganda to say that it's all a plot of the West to get rid of them. But the fact is that people continue to stand up in their ways for women's rights. They continue to, for example, just show themselves with hair uncovered in defiance of compulsory hijab. They gather at nights. Or we have powerful symbols like we had just this week, where Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old woman whose death in police custody in September 2022 sparked the Woman Life Freedom protest, was recognized by the European Parliament with the Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought. Because that wasn't just recognizing Mahsa Amini, it was recognizing all of those in Iran who, not because they were looking for regime change, not because they are U.S. plotters, but because they simply just want a life of decency, tolerance, and hope, continue to make their voices heard, even if the shouts aren't quite as loud, because the regime will not give way.
Yeah. You know, you talked a little bit earlier about the sort of solidarity that has come to Europe as a result of what has happened in Ukraine and potentially the strengthening of NATO. But when we look ahead to 2024, it brings us this likely rematch of the Biden-Trump presidential battle. You know, it's hard to imagine a country voluntarily voting again for the chaos of Trump, but of course there is so much more at stake. When you saw how he broke down institutions, and when we look at the state of the world right now, how critical this US election is going to be.
You know, Bev, I think back in 2020, I said it was the most important US elections since the US Civil War in 1865. I said it in 2022, and I say it again this year, because let us be forthright here. This isn't just a man who is chaotic, who is unpredictable not only in regard to the U.S., but with regard to allies, including Australia, as well as Europe, as well as NATO. This is a man who tried to stage a coup in January 2021 to hold on to office when he was defeated in an election. This is a man who has vowed that, well, he won't be a dictator after day one. But on day one, if he's president, he will be a dictator. But with all of that negative, with all of that gloom that Trump might get in as president, remember that it's not just an election for the presidency. Remember that it's an election for both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And all those people are paying attention to opinion polls as to whether Trump will defeat Joe Biden. Almost none of them are looking at the opinion polls, which are showing that candidates who are calling for a better America, women's rights, gun control, immigration, education, housing, and being just good to each other, that in fact, it's those candidates at local and state level that are the ones who might actually be in Congress in 2024, or 2025, I should say, and give us an alternative if the Donald, despite being a convicted felon, returns to the White House.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the relationships that we've seen the US navigate a little differently is that with China, which had become quite combative. You know, for this region, we see that China still has its own agenda and objectives. Do you think that the US can be a temper to that?
Not just the US, but you in the region as well. I think the key thing here is that there is a return to the rules of the game. You know, we kept thinking, if I talked to you this time last year, would there be war over China? Would there be war over the South China Sea? Would there be an all-out espionage conflict? Now, there's still tension. There's still espionage that goes on. There's still stealing of technology. And there's still economic competition. But it's competition rather than confrontation. It has been symbolized by the visits, the high-level visits of the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State, Commerce Secretary to China. It's been symbolized by the talks over climate change, where the two countries are trying to cooperate, and by President Biden and President Xi meeting. But it's also symbolized by the fact that Australia, South Korea, Japan, and India are not just apart from those talks. They are involved in them in their own ways, where we're talking about regional development and regional stability, and not just simply a return to a Cold War between Washington and Beijing.
Yeah. Scott, we so appreciate your contributions all throughout the year and appreciate our conversation tonight. And you have a very restful festive season if you get one.
We'll raise a glass to you for the new year. Thanks everyone.